All right, we are back again. My name is Alexandra Allred, and I am an adjunct professor with Tarleton State University with the Department of Kinesiology. And this is the second round, so go back and get the intro. But this is where we're going. This is chapter one. We're going to go back and move through history. Bottom screen, you'll see the copy of the book in which I'm teaching from. It's my book. It's coming out in March 2023. So we're skipping over a lot of stuff. If you like something, definitely get the book because you can get so much more information as we delve into the history of women in sports. But it is awesome. So hang on. Here we go. What does ancient Greece, Sparta, and ancient social structures have to do with female athletes today? I love this question because, and this is actually a question that I had from a student. This is really when we get our first peek at the clash of having women in sports, and then you see the big divide after that. There's no question that women were definitely participating in sports before ancient Greece. We'll hit on that in a second. But this is really the first time that it was documented because it was found so distasteful that a lot of the information that we have today comes not from positive reporting. There were no sports reporters getting excited about what they saw, but a lot of the negative images that were given to us. That's how we started to figure out who our warriors were and who our first athletes were. So it's long been perceived as a male domain. And in ancient Greece, the purpose for having the first Olympics was to test their mettle, so to speak, to show the military prowess that they had and allow even Sparta and Athens to sort of size each other up. But women were there, very much there. Of course, it was illegal for women to be go into the Colosseum. Just prostitutes and fair maidens were allowed to go in and watch and cheer, but certainly no other females were allowed to go in there, and definitely not competitors. But this is a great quote that I found. A foreign lady once remarked to the wife of a Spartan commander, that the women of Sparta were the only women in the world who could rule men. And so if we were in class, we'd have a discussion about what did she mean by this. But we'll just jump to it, and I'll just tell you that the punchline here is women were allowed to exercise and engage in sport and some battles, not in real battle, but they practiced as warriors with weapons. They were allowed to do this because the state of Sparta believed, rightfully so, but they believed that when women exercised, it made them stronger, and certainly a stronger woman made for a stronger pregnancy and stronger babies. And the state of Sparta was most interested in strong, healthy, young male babies. So that's kind of where this quote comes from. So it wasn't so much that Spartan women were given equal status, but they had much, but it was with a purpose. So we got the first Olympics. I'll let you take a look at this, but it was in honor of Zeus, the god of the Olympus. And again, no women were allowed. But in 396 BC, the first woman, Caniska, enters into the four-horse chariot race. And if you read about this, it's an incredibly dangerous sport. So the only people who could be in this race were people who were property landowners, owned their own horses. So this was already a select few. However, what most of them did was then they chose their warrior or slave to then participate in the race because it was so incredibly dangerous. But here comes this woman who enters the race. Again, we'll see this theme repeated throughout the beginning of women's history. Is it helped that she was the daughter of a queen, so who was going to challenge her on this? But the reason that she matters was not only did she compete herself, she didn't have someone stand in for her, but she competed herself, and she won. And she didn't just win once. No one thought after that first initial race to then put into the rule book that no woman could compete, because surely this would never happen again. She came back 4 years later and she won again, which you absolutely have to love. You can bet that after that, they made sure that they put in the rule books that women couldn't do that. But why this matters is because she did this. There's a record of that a woman could do this. This started a conversation and investigation into just who were the Spartan women and what were they allowed to do. They were allowed to own property, and they had education, and they trained in sport and did hand-to-hand combat training, and they were considered sexually liberated, and politically they were opinionated. Aristotle, who was not a big fan of females, I'll put it that way, but he had a hatred for Spartan women in particular. And it was because of this, because they were allowed to do these things and they were seen out in public and they were speaking up. He gave us a lot of material on Spartan women. But of course, you see one of his quotes, "Women are unfinished men," gives you an idea of where he was with all this. And as regards to the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. And we would see this again and again and again. And this would explain why, in particular, he really roasted the Amazons and any idea of the Amazons. And even as she became more mythological than real, he still continued his assault on the Amazons. Warrior women who intimidated ancient Greece. That's the description that we have of Amazons. In literature, they're mythical. And they were also used, we believe, as a warning to Athenian girls, don't let this be you. This is what happens to you when you behave in this way. But in the stories that we are presented with regarding Amazons, they are often raped, more so than not. They lose in their battles, and they're man-haters, they're one-breasted, they're hysterical, they're banshees, there's all the negative words that you can think of. But in reality, we know that the Scythian women, the nomadic tribes that were all along Mongolia, what is today Russia, Mongolia, Romania, Central Asia, into Africa, in Iran, and a lot of places in the Middle East, they were there. And after finding so many of their burial sites, and I touched on this in the introduction, initially, a lot of them were labeled as male, because when they find that these skeletal remains where they're honored with having their weapons laid down with them, it was just naturally assumed that they were male warriors. And then there was this remarkable finding in 2017 in which we realized that these are females. And as they found more digs throughout the area listed in front of you, as archaeologists and researchers were finding more digs, they were immediately identifying them. They started to go back, and they're finding that some of the skeletal remains that we believe to be male are actually female, and leading us to conclude that there were actually far more female warriors than we ever imagined possible, and very much including what we saw by Homer and many of the early ancient Greek philosophers and writers, that they were there and they were witnessed. But of course, what we see is these Disney characters. In fact, it's quite exciting to know that Mulan was actually real. We know that Mulan, it was Disneyfied, so there's a lot added into the little that we know, but there was a Mulan. And I go into greater detail about this in the book. But if you're a fan of the Shield Maidens for the Vikings, and then also if you love the movie The Black Panther, the Dahomey Amazon tribes, they were real. There was a real tribe, and they were probably the most recent in time, from 1624 to almost 1900. And what's exciting about them is they were very aggressive warriors in West Africa. And during the slave trade, they not only did they war with their neighboring tribes, but they fought the French. They fought many invading foreigners who came in during the slave trade, and held their own, and got, of all the Amazons written about, they yield the most respect from those who witnessed them and wrote about them, because they were so ferocious, and they were an all-woman warrior tribe. And it's just incredible to know that, they were there, and they support all the earlier writings that we have about the Scythian women. Got to say this little shout out. The bottom left picture is American Ninja Warrior Jessie Graff. And Jessie actually participated in the book, and she was a student at Tarleton State University, so woo. Okay, so the drawings, we find a lot of these. Adrienne Meyer as a great scholar of the early Amazons, but we started to go back and actually look at a lot of the literature and the artifacts and the art that we found, and we're starting to see with fresh new eyes who these warriors were. Of course, their contribution to warfare and tribal leadership is really important. But there were other things that they did. And let me just say that in the book, I go on much more about this, but Amazons invented trousers. Amazons invented the curve bow, the recurve bow, which is a smaller bow, easier to handle, but generates a huge amount of power. And one of the reasons that Aristotle and so many had a problem with the Amazons is they held leadership positions. They had tattoos. They partied. They were considered, their behaviors were not appropriate at all for Athenian women. And while they were out warring and riding and hunting alongside the men, including sharing parental duties, the good Athenian women, they could never behave this way. And in fact, it's one of the first times we really start to pay attention to how restrictive clothing was then, and how that pattern carries throughout time. So to give you an example, in ancient Greek culture, what she wore told you if she was married, widowed, if she was unwed, and if she was unwed, what her status in the society was. And so, for example, a stola, this is incredible to me, but women, if they wore a stola, then men were told to give deference to these women, give them respect, because they were either married, they had money, they came from nobility perhaps. But women who were not wearing the stola were either prostitutes or lower class and could be raped, or certainly raped, and with little punishment to come to the man, given this, whatever the circumstances were. And so a lot of times women of lower class would try to wear a stola to go somewhere, not to try to pretend to be upper class, but just to be able to safely pass along the streets without being assaulted. And if she was found improperly wearing a stola, meaning that she didn't have the standing to do that, she would be severely punished by the controllers of women. And the controllers of women were the appointed magistrates who were allowed to literally walk the streets and decide if she wore too much jewelry, how her hair was, and what her clothes looked like. And they could take the jewelry off of her person and report her, chastise her, even have her severely punished to what they thought. And so we think, wow, that was ancient Greece, right? But then we look and we find, I'll let you read, some of these are headlines that are pulled 2011, 2017, but even in 2022, schoolgirls at private schools are told that they must wear skirts because that's proper behavior and because girls are more fragile. So this is really happening today. And so we ask the question, for female athletes, for girls, everyday girls in or out of sports, who gets to choose how women dress? This is part of the history, and it's important to just take a moment just to say, when we're looking at the differences between male and female histories, no time in history did it really matter what men were wearing in terms of them being punishable on the street, where they could be struck by what they were wearing if someone thought it was inappropriate. Dating all the way back to the 4th century BC, it was decreed that daughters could legally inherit lands from their fathers. But then some 100 years later, this changed when it was decided that too many women were getting land and it took away rights from the men. And so a lot of times, and we see this even today, is what's determined is if it's not fair to men, it cannot happen. If it's not fair to women, it's not spoken about. It really just doesn't matter. So by the 4th century, it was it was decided that women could actually have land handed down from their father. And this went on for not quite 100 years until it was decided that by doing this, by giving women land ownership, it was reducing males' chances of having their own land. And so the laws were effectively reversed pretty much worldwide. This, again, you ask, and I'll let you look at what happened 2,000 years later, but these kind of topics are really important to talk about because this really does lend into how we saw women, i.e., how we saw female athletes. So I love going back into the history of women in this way. It's tough. These are tough topics to talk about. The Mississippi Married Women's Property Act of 1839 was a landmark case. Very few people know about it or talk about it, but it took a woman just like Kaniska, the daughter of a king, to join a chariot race and go unopposed. It took a woman of upstanding character in her community to be able to talk to local officials to get this fixed. And so it was greatly needed, and her action began to change what we saw on the books, legally speaking. But we still have a long way to go. And even now, women take on the name Mrs. Again, this sounds like I'm trying to make something out of nothing, but it lends to, like the controllers of women, how we had to label women. So a Mr. was a Mr. was a Mr. But in the media and in how we saw women culturally and socially and politically and religiously, she needed to have a title. There needed to be some sort of tag to her name so we knew and we understood what her standing was. I walked around a cemetery in just my local area and I found a Miss Maggie, so that I instantly knew what her standing was. And then the Mrs., it was very common that she was no longer a Miss Anna Smith who became a Mrs. Anna Thompson, but now she, even in her death, she carried the Mrs., she carried her husband's name and her husband's last name, and very often her name was her given name at birth was nowhere to be seen. So this kind of stuff is, this, we don't see that as much, but certainly the Ms., Miss, Mrs. is still a part of who we are today, and some people love it, but it makes you have to, the historical reference is we've always had to label who she was. So Belle Squire, I love her. She was not married, but she insisted upon being called Mrs. just for the point of it, and was often told that this was confusing. But I'll let you read her quote there. But basically she says, why is it confusing? If it's confusing, then why aren't we, why are we stopping this? Why do we still do this? And more importantly, it's none of anybody's business what my status is. Things to consider, again, 100 years later at the 2021 Tokyo Games, because this female athlete, this Chinese, she's a shot putter, she doesn't fit the ideal feminine image. And so right after she wins her gold medal, multiple reporters kind of dig into her about, well, are you, without actually asking, they want to know, are you gay? Are you interested in men? When are you going to get married? And then you see what she says is basically she's umming and she's put on the spot. And so it's important for her in her culture, even today, that she just says, well, maybe if I lose weight and I make myself look better, then, maybe I will find a husband. So these are the kind of things that we're going to talk about. I want you to consider that makes women's history unique and so fascinating and frustrating, but there's also a lot of awesome stuff that's coming. So hang on and we will get there.